The Armenian migration to the southwest, which began when the Seljuk invasions made the Araxes Valley and the area around Lake Van unsafe, continued throughout the late 11th century. By the time the Crusaders arrived in eastern Asia Minor, a number of small Armenian principalities had formed, stretching from beyond the central Euphrates River into the Taurus Mountains. The short-lived state founded by the Armenian leader Philaretus had already collapsed before his death in 1090. However, Theros still controlled Edessa, having recently expelled the Turkish garrison from the citadel, and his father-in-law Gabriel remained in control of Melitene. In Marash Thatul, the leading Christian figure in the city, was officially recognized as governor by the Byzantine authorities after the Crusaders handed the town back to them. In Raban and Khayasan, located between Marash and the Euphrates, an Armenian named Kovasiloso, known as Vasil the Rober, had established a small principality. Theros, Duros, Gabriel, and likely Thatul had all once served under Philaretus and had begun their public lives in the Byzantine civil administration. They were not members of the Armenian Church, but belonged to the Orthodox Church, continued to use the official titles they had received long ago from the Byzantine emperor. Whenever possible, they sought to renew ties with the imperial court in Constantinople, reaffirming their loyalty. In fact, Theros had been granted the prestigious title of Curopalates by Emperor Alexius. This imperial affiliation gave their rule a certain legitimacy. However, their power rested more firmly on their willingness to acknowledge the overlordship of nearby Turkish leaders. Theros skillfully played these rival Turkish chieftains against each other, while Gabriel even sent his wife on a diplomatic mission to Baghdad in hopes of gaining recognition from the highest Muslim authorities. Despite their efforts, these Armenian rulers remained in a fragile position. Apart from Kovasil, they were religiously isolated from most of their fellow Armenians and were disliked by the Syrian Christians, who still lived in significant numbers in their domains. Moreover, they were mistrusted by the Turks, and it was only Turkish disunity that allowed them to hold on to power. The Armenians living in the Taurus Mountains faced less immediate danger because the region they inhabited was difficult to reach and easy to defend. Ashin, the son of Hethum, held control over the mountains west of the Silionian Gates. His base was the formidable castle of Lamperin, perched on a high ridge overlooking Tarsus and the Silionian plain. Though his contact with Constantinople was sporadic, he had been granted the title Stratopetrarch of Cilicia by the emperor. While Ashen likely did not belong to the Orthodox Church, he had previously served under Emperor Alexius and had probably taken control of Lamperin with imperial approval. Seizing it from a still unconquered Byzantine garrison, Ashin frequently led raids into the Cilician plain. And in 1097, while the Turks were distracted by the advancing Crusaders, he managed to capture part of the town of Adana, east of the Cilician Gates. The mountains were under the control of Constantine, the son of Rupen. His stronghold was the castle of Partsapert, located northwest of Sis, since his father's death. Constantine had expanded his influence eastward into the anti-Taurus region and had captured the massive fortress of Vaca on the Goksu River from a remote Byzantine garrison. A fervent supporter of the Armenian Church, separate from the Orthodox Church, Constantine maintained his family's long-standing opposition to Byzantium, rooted in his Bagratid heritage. Quoted heritage, like Ashin, he hoped to take advantage of Turkish instability, to establish himself in the prosperous Cilician plain, where many of the inhabitants were already Armenian. Meanwhile, Baldwin of Boulogne had developed an interest in Armenian affairs. At Nicaea, he formed a close alliance with an Armenian named Bagrat, a former official in imperial service and the brother of Kovasil. Bagrat joined Baldwin's entourage, likely seeking his support for the Armenian principalities near the Euphrates, where his family had strong ties. Later at Heraclea, when Tancred declared his plan to break away from the main Crusader army and seek his fortune in Cilicia, Baldwin realized that he could not afford to let another Western prince be the first to engage with the Armenians if he wanted to secure their loyalty for himself. It's unlikely that Baldwin and Tancred had coordinated their actions. Both were younger sons of noble families, with little hope of inheriting power in Europe, and were openly looking to establish their own territories in the East. However, Baldwin had already set his sights on founding an Armenian state, whereas Tancred was simply looking for the most advantageous opportunity. He resisted the idea of detouring to Caesarea because it had been proposed by the Byzantines, who stood to gain from it. Instead, he saw an opportunity in the nearby region, where the presence of a sympathetic Christian population made his ambitions more feasible. Around September 15th, Tancred departed from the Crusader camp at Heraclea with a small force of about 100 knights and 200 infantry. Shortly after, Baldwin set out as well, accompanied by his cousin Baldwin of Leibourg, along with Reynold of Toul, Peter of Stenay, 500 knights, and 2,000 infantry. Neither group brought civilians with them. Baldwin's wife, Godvir, and their children remained behind with the main Crusader army. Tancred took the most direct route toward the Cilician gates, likely following the same path that modern railways used today, passing through Eulacicla. Baldwin, commanding a larger and heavier army, chose the older main road that came from Tiana and passed through Pedondus at the top of the pass. This route put him about 3 days behind Tancred as they moved through the mountains. Once Tancred descended into the Cilician plain, he marched directly toward Tarsus, which remained the principal city in the region. At the same time, he sent messengers back to the main army requesting reinforcements. Tarsus was defended by a Turkish garrison, which immediately launched an attack to drive Tancred away, but was firmly repelled. Seeing an opportunity, the city's Christian residents, Armenians and Greeks, reached out to Tancred and urged him to take control. However, the Turks held their ground until Baldwin's larger force appeared on the horizon 3 days later. Realizing they were outnumbered, Turks slipped away under the cover of night. The next morning, the city's Christian population opened the gates for Tancred, and Baldwin arrived shortly afterward only to find Tancred's banner already flying over the towers. Tancred had no Byzantine official with him and clearly had no plans to hand the city over to the emperor. But Baldwin, who had no more regard for the treaty made in Constantinople, proved to be an even more formidable rival. He insisted that Tarsus be surrendered to him. Though outraged, Tancred was outmatched and had no choice but to comply. He withdrew his troops and marched east toward Edena. Soon after Baldwin took control of Tarsus, a group of 300 Norman soldiers arrived, having been sent from the main army to support Tancred. They pleaded with Baldwin for entry into the city, but he refused to let them in. While they camped outside the walls, the remnants of the Turkish garrison, now roaming the countryside, launched a surprise attack during the night. Every one of the Normans was killed. The massacre shocked the Crusader forces. Baldwin was held responsible, even by many within his own army, and his position could have been seriously compromised. However, the situation was quickly transformed by unexpected news. A Christian fleet had arrived in the Bay of Mersin, at the mouth of the Kidnus River just below the city, under the command of Ginimer of Boulogne. Ginimer was a professional pirate who had the foresight to recognize that the crusade would require naval support. In the late spring, he gathered a band of fellow pirate Staines, Frisians, and Flemingzons sailed from the Netherlands into the eastern Mediterranean, hoping to make contact with the Crusader forces. Despite his outlaw status, he remained loyal to his homeland, and so he was thrilled to encounter an army commanded by the brother of his own count. He sailed up the Kidnus River to Tarsus and pledged allegiance to Baldwin. In return, Baldwin borrowed 300 of his men to garrison the city and likely appointed Ginimer as his deputy there, while he prepared to march eastward. Meanwhile, Tancred found Edena in a state of turmoil. Chin of Lamperin had recently raided the city and left a detachment behind, which was now clashing with the Turks for control. Additionally, a Burgundian knight named Welf, who had probably started out with Baldwin's army, but then struck out on his own in search of opportunity, had seized the citadel. When Tancred arrived, the Turks withdrew, and Welf welcomed his forces into the fortress, effectively securing his control over the town. Ashin, likely concerned only with safely withdrawing his men from a precarious situation, was grateful for Tancred's arrival. He encouraged Tancred to press on to Mamastra, ancient Mopsuestia, where the local Armenian population was eager to be freed from Turkish rule. Ashin had another motive. He hoped to see the Franks move into the territory claimed by his rival, Constantine of the Ruppenian line. Tancred reached Mamistra in early October. As in Edena, the Turks fled at his approach, and the Christian inhabitants welcomed him into the city. Soon afterward, Baldwin and his army arrived. By this time, Baldwin had likely already decided that his future domain would not be in Cilicia. Perhaps the hot, humid, and malaria-prone climate in September had discouraged him. Perhaps he saw Cilicia as too close to the increasingly powerful Byzantine Empire. His advisor Bagrat was urging him eastward, where Armenian leaders were calling for aid. In any case, Baldwin had already undermined Tancred's efforts to establish a stronghold in Cilicia and was now returning to the main Crusader force to consult with his brother and companions before beginning a new campaign. Tancred, however, was wary. He refused to allow Baldwin into Mamistra and made him camp across the river Gihon. Still, he permitted supplies to be sent from the city to Baldwin's camp. But resentment lingered, especially among Tancred's followers. Many Normans led by his brother-in-law Richard of the Principate were furious that Baldwin had not been punished for seizing Tarsus. They convinced Tancred to join them in a surprise attack on Baldwin's camp. The plan backfired. Baldwin's forces were too numerous and too strong. Quickly driving the attackers back across the river in disarray, the disgraceful clash stirred backlash, and eventually Baldwin and Tancred agreed to a reconciliation. But the damage was done. It had become painfully obvious that the Crusader leaders were unwilling to work together for the sake of Christendom when personal gain was at stake. The local Christian populations quickly picked up on this and realized that their supposed Frankish liberators were motivated more by self-interest than by noble ideals. They soon learned the advantage of playing one Frankish prince against another for their own benefit. After reconciling with Tancred at Mamistra, Baldwin quickly made his way back to rejoin the main Crusader army at Marash. He had received word that his wife Godver was dying. Their children, too, were gravely ill and soon passed away. Baldwin stayed only a few days with his brothers and the other leaders of the army. When the main force set out to march south toward Antioch, he chose instead to strike out eastward, hoping to make his fortune in the Euphrates Valley and the lands beyond. His new expedition was much smaller than the one he had led into Cilicia. Perhaps his standing as a commander had suffered after the events at Tarsus. Perhaps his brothers, focused on capturing Antioch, were unwilling to spare more troops. This time he took only 100 horsemen. Still by his side was his Armenian advisor, Bagrat, and he was now joined by a new chaplain, the historian Fulcher of Chartres. Tancred left Mamistra not long after Baldwin's departure. Leaving behind a small garrison, he marched southward around the top of the Gulf of Issus to Alexandretta. Along the way, he sent messengers to Guinamar, who was likely still based in Tarsus, asking for his support. Guinamar responded enthusiastically and brought his fleet to join Tancred outside Alexandretta. Together they launched an assault and captured the town. Tancred left a garrison there, then crossed the Amanus Mountains via the Syrian gates to rejoin the Crusader army before Antioch. In the end, the Cilician campaign brought little real gain for either Baldwin or Tancred. Neither found it worthwhile to try to establish a principality there. The small Frankish garrisons left behind Guinamars and Tarsus, Welfs in Edena, and Tancreds in Mamistra were far too weak to resist any serious counterattack. However, the campaign had some strategic value. By dispersing the Turkish forces in Cilicia, it prevented the region from being used as a base for a flank attack against the Crusaders as they laid siege to Antioch. The capture of Alexandretta also gave the Crusaders a valuable port, allowing supplies to flow more easily to their armies. Still, the greatest beneficiaries of the entire campaign were the Armenian princes of the highlands. With Turkish control in the plains broken, they gradually moved in occupying villages and towns, and began laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the Cilician kingdom of Little Armenia. When Baldwin left the main Crusader army at Marash, preparing to march south toward Antioch. At first, he followed a route that ran parallel to the main armies. a few miles to the east, in order to protect its left flank. It's likely that he secured permission to separate again from the main force by offering to carry out this task. In fact, his entire expedition could be justified as a defensive measure for the crusade, since the most accessible route by which reinforcements from Khorasan could reach the Turks at Antioch passed through the very region he intended to enter. Additionally, the area's fertile land could help supply the Crusaders with much-needed provisions. At Antab, Baldwin veered sharply eastward. It's unclear whether he had a specific plan beyond a general ambition to establish a principality on the Euphrates, something that could serve both his personal ambitions and the broader goals of the crusade. The timing was in his favor. He didn't need to wrest the land from Muslim control, as it was already held by friendly Armenian rulers. He was in contact with these Armenian lords. Through Bagrat, he likely established ties with Bagrat's brother, Kovasil, who ruled directly east of Marash. Gabriel of Melitene, who was constantly threatened by the Danishman Turks, was probably seeking Frankish assistance. Theros of Edessa was definitely in communication with the Crusaders. In fact, Baldwin's departure from Cilicia may have been prompted by a message they received by him or by Bagrat from Theros, urgently inviting him to Edessa. The Armenians had long been hoping for help from the west. 2 decades earlier, when Pope Gregory VII was planning an expedition to support Eastern Christians, an Armenian bishop had gone to Rome to gain his backing. Even those Armenian leaders who held Byzantine titles generally viewed Western support more favorably than any increased dependence on the Byzantine Empire, which they deeply resented. The arrival of a Frankish army fighting successfully for the Christian cause just beyond their borders gave them the opportunity they had long awaited to break free from both Turkish and Byzantine control. They welcomed Baldwin and his men enthusiastically, seeing them as liberators. Today we've learned to be cautious about the word liberation. The Armenians learned that lesson much earlier. As Baldwin advanced toward the Euphrates, the Armenian population rose to greet him. The remaining Turkish garrisons either fled or were killed by local Christians. The only notable Turkish leader in the region, Emir Baldak of Samosatu, controlled the road between Edessa and Melitene, tried to resist but couldn't mount any real counterattack. 2 local Armenian nobles, known to the Crusaders as Fur and Nicusus, joined Baldwin, with their small forces asterisk by the early winter of 1097. Baldwin had completed his conquest of the region, up to the Euphrates. He captured the 2 major fortresses of Ravendell and Turbasol known to the Latins as the adapted forms of Rwandan and Tel Basher. Ravandal, which secured his communications with Antioch, was placed under the command of his Armenian advisor. Bagrat, Turbasol, located near the crucial Euphrates crossing at ancient Carchemish, was given to Fur. While Baldwin was still at Turbasol, likely around the beginning of the new year, delegation arrived from Edessa. Theros was growing anxious about the delay, watching from the east bank of the Euphrates as the Franks lingered on the western side. His situation had always been fragile, and now he was deeply alarmed by reports that Kerboga, the powerful Turkish Emir of Mosul, was assembling a massive army, though its primary mission was to relieve Antioch. It could easily overrun Edessa and the nearby Armenian territories on its way, but Baldwin had no intention of heading to Edessa unless the terms were right. Theros had originally hoped to hire him as a mercenary, paying him with money and lavish gifts. It was now clear, however, that Baldwin wanted far more. The embassy from Edessa had come prepared to offer just that. Theros would adopt Baldwin as his son and heir and immediately make him curler of his lands. Theros, aging and childless, saw this as the only way forward. It wasn't his preferred solution. But he was unpopular at home and surrounded by threats. He had little choice. Not all Armenians were pleased. Among the more far-sighted, there was growing unease. This was not the outcome Bagrat had envisioned when he introduced Baldwin to Armenian politics. In fact, Bagrat himself was the first to show signs of dissatisfaction. While the Franks were still at Turbasol, for likely seeking to replace Bagrat as Baldwin's most trusted Armenian advisor, accused him of conspiring with the Turks. It's more likely that Bagrat was merely consulting with his brother, Kovasil, about the looming threat to Armenian independence. Perhaps he also hoped to establish himself as ruler of Ravendell. Baldwin, however, was taking no chances. He immediately dispatched troops to Ravendell to arrest Bagrat. Brought before Baldwin, Bagrat was tortured to extract a confession. In early February 1098, Baldwin left Turbisol for Edessa with only 80 knights. Turkish forces from Samosata had set up an ambush near the expected crossing point on the Euphrates, likely at Bajragic, but Baldwin evaded them by crossing at a ford further to the north. He reached Edessa on February 6th and was welcomed with great enthusiasm by both Thuros and the city's Christian population. Soon afterward, Thuros formally adopted him as his son. The ceremony followed traditional Armenian customs, though it was more suited to adopting a child than an adult. Baldwin was stripped to the waist, while Thuros donned an oversized shirt and pulled it over Baldwin's head. The two men then pressed their bare chests together. Baldwin later repeated the ritual with Tharos's wife, the princess. Once Baldwin had been established as heir and curler of Edessa, he recognized that his first priority was to eliminate the nearby Turkish emirate of Samosata, which posed a constant threat to his connection with the West. The people of Edessa enthusiastically supported this plan, as Emir Baldak was their most persistent enemy, frequently raiding their fields and livestock, and even extorting tribute. From the city itself, Baldwin set out on the campaign against Samosata between February 14th and 20th, accompanied by the Edessian militia, his Frankish knights, and Constantine of Gargar, an Armenian noble who was a vassal of Thuros. However, the expedition did not go well. The Edessian troops were inexperienced and poorly trained. The Turks surprised them in battle and killed around 1,000 of their number, forcing the army to retreat. Despite the setback, Baldwin managed to seize and fortify a nearby village called St. John, close to the emir's stronghold. He stationed most of his knights there to monitor and restrict Turkish movements. This action led to a noticeable drop in Turkish raids, and the Armenians readily gave Baldwin credit for the improvement. Not long after Baldwin returned to Edessa, a conspiracy began to form against Thuros, with the backing of Constantine of Gargar. Baldwin's exact involvement remains unclear. His supporters denied he had any part in it. But according to the Armenian chronicler Matthew, Baldwin had been informed of the plot to overthrow Thuros in his favor. The people of Edessa had little affection for Thuros, despite his efforts to keep their city independent. They resented him for being part of the Orthodox Church and for holding a title from the Byzantine Empire. He had failed to shield their crops and trade from Turkish attacks and was known for imposing heavy taxes. But before Baldwin arrived, they had no better alternative. Now, with a stronger and more capable protector in their midst, they were ready for change. The conspiracy likely required no encouragement from the Franks, but it's difficult to believe. The plotters would have acted without at least Baldwin's tacit approval. On Sunday, March 7th, the conspirators made their move. They stirred up the citizens, who attacked the homes of Thuros's officials and then stormed the prince's palace in the citadel. Thuros's soldiers abandoned him. Baldwin, though now his adopted son, did nothing to help. He merely advised Thuros to surrender. Thuros agreed, asking only that he and his wife be allowed to retire to her father's home in Melitene. Although Baldwin seemingly gave assurances for his safety, Thuros was not allowed to leave. He was imprisoned in his palace, and on Tuesday he tried to escape through a window. He was captured and killed by the angry mob, torn apart by the crowd. What happened to his wife Baldwin's adoptive mother remains unknown. On Wednesday, March 10th, people of Edessa formally invited Baldwin to take control of the government. Baldwin had finally achieved his goal of securing a principality. While Edessa wasn't located in the Holy Land, a Frankish state along the Middle Euphrates could still serve as a valuable defensive outpost for any future Crusader states in Palestine. Baldwin could justify his actions under the broader objectives of the Crusade. However, he couldn't legally justify them to all of Christendom. Edessa had once belonged to the Byzantine emperor before the Turkish conquests, which meant it was covered by the oath Baldwin had sworn in Constantinople. Moreover, he had taken control of the city by forcing out and arguably allowing the murder of a governor who was, at least officially, still a recognized servant of the empire, but Baldwin had already shown in Cilicia that his oath meant little. To him, At Edessa, Thoros himself had been willing to hand over power without consulting his distant overlord. Still, the incident did not go unnoticed by Emperor Alexius, who quietly reserved his rights over the territory for a time when he might be able to reclaim them. Later, Armenian historians, writing after it had become clear that Frankish rule had led to the collapse of Armenian control along the Euphrates, harshly criticized Baldwin. But their judgment may not have been entirely fair. There's no moral defense for how Baldwin treated Thoros, as even Latin chroniclers showed discomfort in how they recorded the event. Thoros, years earlier, had done something similar to a Turkish leader named Alphalag, whom he invited to defend Edessa from the Danishman Turksoni, to have him killed later. But in that case, Thoros had acted to save his city from foreign tyranny, and Alphalag had never been adopted as his son. While Armenian custom treated adoption as a less serious bond than in Western law, that doesn't lessen Baldwin's moral responsibility. Even so, the Armenians were not entirely innocent in the matter. Thoros was ultimately murdered by his own people, and it was they who invited Baldwin to take his place with now unanimous support. The Armenian princes who would later be displaced by the Crusaders, and who alone mistrusted the Westerners, were former officials of the Byzantine Empire. They were often disliked by their fellow Armenians because of their loyalty to the emperor and even more so for having joined the Orthodox Church. These former Byzantine administrators, like Thoros and Gabriel, were the only leaders with enough political experience to preserve Armenian independence along the Euphrates. Other people, driven by hatred for Byzantium and willing to overlook in Latins the same doctrinal heresies they condemned in Greeks, had only themselves to blame. If their new Frankish allies ultimately led them to ruin, for the time being, everything seemed to be going well. Baldwin took the title of Count of Edessa and made it clear that he intended to rule alone. But his number of Frankish soldiers was small, so he had to depend heavily on Armenians to help him govern. Fortunately, he found several locals he could trust, and his job was made easier by a significant discovery: a large hoard of treasure hidden in the citadel. Much of it dated back to the Byzantine era, and Thoros had added to it through his heavy taxation. This newfound wealth gave Baldwin the means to both buy loyalty and pull off a major diplomatic success. The Emir Balduc of Samosata, alarmed by Baldwin's rise to power, became nervous when he saw preparations for another campaign against his city. Hoping to avoid conflict, he sent word to Baldwin offering to sell his emirate for 10,000 bezants. Baldwin agreed and entered Samosata in triumph. Inside the citadel, he found many hostages that Balduc had taken from Edessa. He promptly released them and returned them to their families. This gesture, along with his removal of the Turkish threat from Samosata, made him immensely popular. Baldwin even invited Balduc to come live in Edessa, bringing his bodyguard with him to serve. As mercenaries under the Count, as news of Baldwin's success spread, several Western knights who were either en route to join the Crusader army at Antioch or already growing tired of the prolonged siege decided to seek their fortune with him instead. Among them were Drogo of Nessel, Reynold of Toul, and Gaston of Bern, a vassal of Raymond. Baldwin welcomed them generously, offering valuable gifts from his treasury and encouraging them to settle in the region by marrying Armenian heiresses. He himself led by example, is now widowed and without children. Baldwin remarried. His new wife was the daughter of a local chieftain, known in Latin chronicles as Tafnus or Tafrica, wealthy nobleman who owned land nearby and was likely related to Constantine of Gargar. He also had ties to Constantinople, where he eventually retired. It's possible this man was the same as Thule, the ruler of Marash, whose alliance would have been a strategic advantage for Baldwin. The bride came with a dowry of 60,000 bezants and a vague promise of inheriting her father's lands. However, the marriage brought her little happiness, and no children resulted from the union. Asterisk in this way, Baldwin began laying the foundations of the political approach he would later apply in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He believed that the authority of the state should remain firmly in the hands of the Frankish prince and his Frankish vassals, but that both Christians and Muslims from the region should be welcome to participate in public life Over time, he envisioned a merging of races and cultures into a unified society. It was a policy rooted in pragmatic, far-sighted statesmanship, however. Too many newly arrived knights from the Westmen who had taken vows to serve the cross and eliminate the infidel. It felt like a betrayal of the Crusades' holy mission. After all, they had not left Europe to see men like Baldwin establish semi-oriental kingdoms. Even for Baldwin, the policy was not easy to implement. Muslim leaders saw him as a temporary opportunist they might use to their advantage. To the southwest of Edessa, between the city and the Euphrates, lay the Muslim town of Saruj, though it owed allegiance to Balak ibn Bahram, an Ordoqid prince. Saruj had recently rebelled. Balak reached out to Baldwin, proposing to hire him to help suppress the revolt. Baldwin, eager to expand his influence, agreed, but the citizens of Saruj secretly appealed to Emir Baldak for protection of Edessa and were allowed into the city. Baldwin followed quickly, bringing siege engines with him. Faced with the prospect of a siege, both Baldak and the people of Saruj lost their nerve. The townspeople offered to surrender and pay tribute. Baldak came out to meet Baldwin, claiming he had only entered the city on Baldwin's behalf. Baldwin saw through the lie. He accepted Balduk's apology for the moment and appeared to forgive him. But days later, Baldwin demanded that Baldak hand over his wife and children as hostages. When Baldak hesitated, Baldwin had him arrested and executed, beheading him on the spot. Afterward, Baldwin stationed a Frankish garrison in Saruj, placing it under the command of Fulk of Chartres, not to be confused with the chronicler Fulcher of Chartres. This incident taught Baldwin a harsh lesson. Muslim leaders could not be trusted to act in good faith. From that point on, he ensured that any Muslims living within his territories had no independent leadership. However, he still permitted them to practice their religion freely. In a city like Saruj, where nearly all the inhabitants were Arab Muslims, he had little choice. But this practical tolerance scandalized many in the West, who expected the crusade to bring religious purity, not coexistence. The capture of Saruj and, a few months later, the strategic town of Bayrajik, with its crucial Euphrates crossing, secured. Baldwin's control over the key roads between Edessa and his fortresses at Turbasol and Ravandel. These victories not only consolidated his hold over the county but also ensured reliable communication with the main crusading forces. At the same time, they sent a clear message to the Muslim powers. The Count of Edessa was not to be underestimated. Determined to crush this rising Frankish power, they turned their attention to Baldwin. Their seriousness on the strategic importance of a Frankish-held Edessa became apparent in May, when the formidable Kerboga, en route to relieve the Siege of Antioch, paused his march to try to eliminate Baldwin first. He laid siege to Edessa for 3 weeks, but failed to breach its defenses and was forced to retreat. His failure greatly enhanced Baldwin's reputation. The time he wasted at Edessa proved critical. It allowed the Crusaders the breathing room they needed to hold Antioch. But Baldwin also faced resistance from the Armenians. They had underestimated him at first, and now resented the growing number of Frankish knights entering their lands, as well as the favors Baldwin was granting to them. The newcomers treated the local Armenians with little respect, often with outright contempt and brutality. Edessa's Armenian elite found themselves excluded from Baldwin's council, where only Franks were allowed to participate, yet they still had to pay the same heavy taxes they had under Thros. Worse still, Armenian estates in the countryside were being redistributed to the new Frankish lords. The local farmers were now subject to the stricter feudal customs of the West. Late in 1098, Baldwin received a warning from an Armenian informant about a plot against his life. The conspiracy allegedly involved 12 of the city's leading citizens, who were believed to be in contact with Turkish emirs from the region of Diyarbakir. At that time, Baldwin's father-in-law, Tafnus, happened to be visiting Edessa. As his daughter's marriage to Baldwin had only recently taken place, rumors suggested that the conspirators aimed to replace Baldwin with Tafnus, or at least force him to share power. Baldwin reacted immediately. He had the 2 ringleaders arrested and blinded, while their close associates had their noses or feet cut off. Many other Armenians suspected of involvement were thrown in prison, and their properties were seized. However, in typically shrewd fashion, they had hidden their wealth so effectively that Baldwin's men couldn't find it. Baldwin then allowed them to buy back their freedom, charging between 20 and 60,000 bezants each. As for Tafnus, even though his involvement couldn't be proven, he wisely chose to retreat to the safety of his mountain stronghold. Away from his intimidating son-in-law, he took with him most of the dowry he had promised his daughter, of which he had delivered only a mere 700 bezants. Baldwin's ruthless suppression of the conspiracy effectively silenced any further unrest among his Armenian subjects. Though he continued to appoint a few locals to significant positions, such as Abul Gharib, whom he made governor of Bayruzhiki, gradually shifted his reliance toward the growing number of Franks arriving to join him. Drawn by his rising fame, within less than a year of taking control in Edessa, Baldwin's reputation had soared. While the main crusading army was still struggling on the long road to Jerusalem, he had already carved out a wealthy and powerful state deep in Asia. He was now both feared and respected across the Eastern world. His transformation was remarkable. He had begun the crusade as the youngest son in his family, without wealth, and relying on the goodwill of his brothers. Overshadowed by leading nobles like Raymond of Toulouse and Hugh of Vermandois, as well as by seasoned adventurers like Bohemond, he had seemed unlikely to rise far. Yet now he stood above them, all a ruler in his own right, and the most capable and politically shrewd leader the crusade had produced. The city of Antioch is situated along the Orontes River, around 12 miles from the Mediterranean coast. Founded in 300 BC by Seleucus I of Syria and named after his father, Antioch quickly rose to prominence as the leading city in Asia. During the Roman Empire, it was the third largest city in the world. For Christians, Antioch held special spiritual significance. It was here that followers of Jesus were first called Christians, and it was where St. Peter established his first bishopric. Antioch's glory diminished in the 6th century AD. Following a series of earthquakes and a destructive sack by Persian forces, the city's decline continued under Arab rule as it lost influence to the inland city of Aleppo. A brief resurgence came in the 10th century when the Byzantines reclaimed it, restoring some of its former prominence. Antioch became a hub of commerce between Greeks and Muslims, and one of the strongest fortresses on the Syrian frontier. In 1085, the city was captured by Suleiman ibn Kutelmish. After his death, it came under the control of Sultan Malik Shah, who appointed the Turkoman warlord Yogisian as governor. Yogisian ruled Antioch for 10 years. Although technically a vassal of Ridwan, the emir of Aleppo, Yogisian maintained real independence by skillfully manipulating the rivalry between Ridwan and other Muslim leaders, such as Dukak of Damascus and Kerboga of Mosul. In 1096, he even betrayed Ridwan during a conflict with Dukak, whom he then began to recognize as his overlord. This act of treachery failed to help Dukak take Aleppo and left Ridwan resentful and unforgiving. The advance of the Crusaders deeply unsettled Yogisian. Antioch was their clear objective. Without controlling this major stronghold, the Crusader army would not be able to proceed south toward Palestine. The city's population was mostly Christian, Greeks, Armenians, and Syrians. While the Syrian Christians, who disliked both Greeks and Armenians, might stay loyal to him, Yogisian feared the rest could not be trusted. Until then, his rule had been relatively tolerant. The Orthodox Patriarch, John the Oxite, had been allowed to live in the city, and the churches had remained intact. But with the Crusaders approaching, Yogisian began to crack down. The Patriarch, as the most prominent Christian figure in Antioch, was imprisoned. Many leading Christians were expelled, while others fled on their own. The Cathedral of St. Peter was desecrated and turned into a stable for the emir's horses. Persecutions also occurred in nearby villages, provoking immediate retaliation. As villagers rose up and slaughtered Turkish garrisons once the Crusaders neared, Yaghi-Siyan, seeing the Crusaders approaching and Antioch in grave danger, urgently sought allies. His old overlord Ridwan of Aleppo refused to help, still angry at Yogisian's betrayal the year before. But Dukak of Damascus responded more favorably. Yaghisian's son, Shamsa-Dowlah, traveled in person to request his aid, and Dukak prepared a relief expedition. He was supported by his military commander Tatakin, a Turkoman, and by Jana ad-Dowlah, the emir of Homs. Another appeal went to Kurboga, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, and now the most influential Muslim leader in northern Mesopotamia and the Jazira region. Kurboga recognized that the Crusaders posed a serious threat to the entire Islamic world. He also had ambitions of taking Aleppo, and acquiring Antioch would allow him to surround Ridwan and potentially bring Aleppo under his control. He began assembling a large army for the campaign and secured promises of support from the sultans of Baghdad and Persia. Meanwhile, Yaghisian fortified Antioch, stockpiled supplies, and prepared for a long siege. The Crusaders advanced into his territory, reaching the small town of Murata. The Turkish garrison fled at their approach. From there, Robert of Flanders led a detachment to liberate the nearby town of Arta, where local Christians had already revolted and massacred the garrison. On the 20th of October, the main crusading army arrived at the iron bridge over the Orontes River. Where key roads from Marash and Aleppo met, the bridge was heavily fortified with twin towers guarding the entrance. But the Crusaders attacked it immediately. The Bishop of Le Puy directed the assault, and after fierce fighting, they seized the bridge along with a large convoy of livestock and grain headed to supply Antioch's defenders. With the path to the city clear, men led the vanguard forward and arrived before Antioch's walls the next day. The rest of the army soon followed. The Crusaders were awestruck by Antioch. The vast city stretched nearly 3 miles along the plain between the Orontes River and Mount Silpius, with elegant homes and palaces climbing the hillside. It was protected by enormous fortifications, originally built by Emperor Justinian and restored a century earlier by Byzantine engineers using state-of-the-art techniques. To the north, the walls emerged from the low-lying marshes by the river. To the east and west, they climbed the steep slopes of the mountain. To the south, they ran along the summit of a high ridge, even spanning a deep ravine cut by the Anopnicles torrent via the narrow-walled iron gate. The walls culminated in a mighty citadel perched 1,000 feet above the city. 400 towers reinforced the defenses, space to allow overlapping fields of archery fire. Key entrances included the Gate of St. Paul to the northeast, leading to the Iron Bridge in Aleppo, the Gate of St. George to the northwest, leading to Lataki and the coast, a river gate leading to the port of St. Simeon, modern Swadai, connected by a fortified bridge. Smaller gates, like the Gate of the Duke and the Gate of the Dog, which access points further along the river, inside the walls. Antioch had ample fresh water, vegetable gardens, grazing space for livestock, and enough shelter and provisions to support a large defending army for an extended siege. Importantly, the terrain to the south was too rugged and steep for an effective blockade, making a complete encirclement of the city. It's impossible for the Crusaders. Antioch had fallen to the Turks in 1085, not by force of arms, but through treachery and... Now, ironically, treachery was Yaghisian's greatest fear. His garrison was too small to fully man the city's vast walls. And until reinforcements arrived, he dared not risk losing any men in offensive actions. So, when the Crusaders approached, he did nothing to hinder them. For 2 full weeks after their arrival, he left them unchallenged. The Crusaders, for their part, set up their positions outside the city's northeastern corner. Boulogne took up position opposite the Gate of St. Paul. Raymond of Toulouse stationed his forces near the Gate of the Dog, and Godfrey of Boulogne held the line by the Gate of the Duke. Other Crusader contingents remained in reserve behind Boulogne, ready to reinforce any point as needed. For the time being, the important bridge gate and the Gate of St. George on the western side of the city were left uncovered to maintain their access to supplies and communication. The Crusaders immediately began constructing a bridge of boats across the Orontes River from Godfrey's camp to the village of Talenki on the northern bank near the Muslim cemetery. This new crossing gave them a route to Alexandretta and St. Simeon, the latter being their main port of supply. Soon, a camp was also established on the far side of the river, Yaghi-Siyan, had expected the Crusaders to launch an immediate assault. He feared they might overwhelm him before reinforcements could arrive, but only Raymond of Toulouse advocated for an early attack. Trusting in divine providence, he urged that they strike the city at once. God, who has protected us thus far, will surely give us the victory. But the other leaders were not so sure. The city's imposing fortifications intimidated them. Their soldiers were exhausted, and they could not afford heavy casualties. Delaying seemed the safer path. They hoped for reinforcements. Tancred was marching from Alexandretta. Perhaps even Emperor Alexius would arrive with Byzantine siege engines. Guynemer's fleet might spare some troops. And there were whispers of a Genoese fleet approaching the coast. More than anyone, Bohemond was opposed to the idea of an immediate assault, though his reasons were personal. He had now set his sights on Antioch as his own prize. Joint conquest by the Crusader army might doom his chances of claiming the city for himself. He remembered what had happened at Nicaea, where the Byzantines had claimed the city after the Crusaders fought to capture it. If Bohemond could secure Antioch's surrender through diplomacy or betrayal, then he could stake a much stronger and exclusive claim. He therefore argued against Raymond's plan and convinced the other leaders to wait. Raymond, already deeply suspicious of Bohemond, grew more bitter, and the window of opportunity for a swift conquest closed. Had the Crusaders attacked immediately, Yaghi-Siyan, rattled and unsure, might not have held out. But the delay gave him time to recover his confidence and prepare for a prolonged siege. Bohemond and his supporters had little trouble finding intermediaries to establish secret communication with those inside Antioch. Thanks to the weak points in both the Crusaders' blockade and the city's defense, Christian refugees and exiles outside the walls remained in contact with their relatives still inside. This informal network allowed the Crusaders to stay well informed about what was happening within the city, but the same lines of communication worked in reverse. Many of the local Christians, especially the Syrians, were not necessarily loyal to the Crusaders. They were skeptical of whether rule by the Byzantines or Franks would truly be any better than rule under the Turks, and some of them sought to win Yaghi-Siyan's favor by keeping him updated on Crusader plans and weaknesses. It was from these informants that Yaghi-Siyan learned the Crusaders were hesitant to launch a full assault. Encouraged by this intelligence, Yaghi-Siyan began organizing sorties. His troops would slip out through the western gate and ambush small groups of Crusaders out foraging beyond the main army's protection. He also re-established contact with his garrison at Harans, a fortress beyond the Iron Bridge on the road to Aleppo, and instructed them to harass the Crusader forces from the rear. Meanwhile, good news reached him. His son Shams ad-Dawlah's mission to Damascus had succeeded. An army was being raised to relieve Antioch as autumn turned into winter. The Crusaders' early optimism, based on Yaghi-Siyan's initial passivity, began to fade. Although they scored some important victories, morale was slipping. In mid-November, Bohemond led an expedition that succeeded in tricking the garrison of Harans into leaving their fortress, where they were promptly ambushed and annihilated. Almost simultaneously, a long-awaited Genoese fleet of 13 ships arrived at the port of St. Simeon, which the Crusaders quickly secured. These ships brought badly needed men, weapons, and supplies. A delayed response to Pope Urban II's plea to Genoa 2 years earlier. The Crusaders now had a crucial advantage: a direct sea link to the west for communication and resupply. Yet, these gains were overshadowed by a growing crisis: food shortages. When they had first arrived in the fertile plain of Antioch, the Crusaders had found it well stocked, plenty of sheep, cattle, and full village granaries. They had eaten well, but failed to store provisions for the coming winter. Now, as supplies dwindled, soldiers were forced to forage further and further afield, making them more vulnerable to Turkish raiders, especially those using the mountain terrain to their advantage. It became clear that raiders from Antioch were using the gorge of the Anapnicals, climbing to the hill above Bohemon's camp, attacking Crusaders returning late from the countryside. To counter this threat, the Crusader leaders agreed to build a fortified watchtower on that strategic hilltop. Each leader pledged to take turns garrisoning it. The tower was quickly completed and given a fittingly grim name, Malregard, or Evil Watch. Around Christmas, the army had nearly run out of food, and there was nothing left to gather from the surrounding countryside. The princes met in council and agreed that part of the army should go north, up the Orontes Valley toward Hama to raid villages and collect whatever supplies they could find. Bohemond and Robert of Flanders were chosen to lead the expedition, while the Siege of Antioch would be left in the hands of Raymond and the Bishop of Le Puy. Godfrey was too ill to take part. Yagisian quickly learned of their departure. Once they were far enough away, he made his move. On the night of December 29th, he launched a strong sortie across the bridge, attacking the Crusaders camped north of the river. These were likely Raymond's men, who had moved away from their original camp due to flooding from the winter rains. The attack caught them off guard, but Raymond reacted swiftly, gathered a group of knights and charged into the darkness, driving the Turks back across the bridge. His counterattack was so forceful that for a moment his troops managed to get across the bridge into the city before the gates could be shut, it looked like. Raymond might actually take Antioch and prove that the city could be stormed after all. But in the chaos, a riderless horse suddenly bolted into the crowd of knights packed onto the bridge, throwing them into confusion. In the darkness, no one could tell what was happening. Panic spread among the Crusaders, and they began to retreat. The Turks took advantage and chased them all the way back to their camp by the bridge of boats. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the Crusaders lost more, including Adamar's own standard-bearer, a serious blow to morale. Meanwhile, Bohemond and Robert were heading south, completely unaware of how close Raymond had come to capturing Antioch, or that a large Muslim army was heading their way. Dukhak of Damascus, with his general Totokin and Yagisian's son, Shams, had set out from Damascus in mid-December with a sizable force. The emir of Hama joined them as they passed. On December 30th, they reached Shezar, where they learned that a crusader force was nearby. They marched straight for them, and the next morning surprised the Crusaders near the village of Albara. Robert's forces were slightly ahead of Bohemond's and nearly surrounded. But Bohemond, seeing the danger, held most of his troops back until the right moment. Then he charged into the Muslim army just when they thought they had won. His timing turned the tide. The Muslim force took heavy losses and retreated back to Hama. Although the Crusaders technically won the battle and prevented Antioch from being relieved, they had suffered too many losses to continue raiding. After burning a few villages and a mosque, they returned to Antioch nearly empty-handed. When Bohemond and Robert returned, they found the rest of the army in a state of deep despair. The disastrous battle on the night of December 29th had been followed the next day by a severe earthquake so powerful that it was felt all the way in Edessa, and that evening, the northern sky lit up with an eerie display of the aurora borealis. In the following weeks, torrential rains fell without stopping, and the cold grew steadily worse. Stephen of Blois remarked that he couldn't understand why anyone had ever complained about the Syrian sun too many. It was clear that God was angry at the Crusaders for their pride, their indulgence, and their tendency to plunder. In response, Adhemar of Le Puy ordered a solemn 3-day fast. But with famine already looming, fasting didn't help much. The failure of the foraging expedition now meant that many would starve. Before long, 1 out of every 7 men was dying from hunger. Envoys were sent as far away as the Taurus Mountains to search for food. The Rupenian Armenian princes agreed to help as much as they could. Supplies also trickled in from Armenian monks in the Amanus Mountains, and local Armenian and Syrian Christians brought whatever edible goods they could find to the Crusader camp. But they did so for profit, not charity. A single donkey load of food was sold for 8 bezants, prices that only the wealthiest knights could afford. Horses suffered even more than the men. In the end, only about 700 horses remained in the entire army. A more generous source of help came from the island of Cyprus. The Bishop of Le Puy, likely following Pope Urban's instructions, had been diligent in forming good relations with Eastern Orthodox leaders. He treated them with a level of respect that contradicts the theory that the Pope had planned to use the crusade to bring the Eastern Church under his authority. The imprisoned Patriarch of Antioch, still within the city, had little benefit from this outreach. The Turks would occasionally lock him in a cage and hang him from the city walls. But Patriarch Simeon of Jerusalem, who had left his post after Ortok's death, made the city too dangerous, had relocated to Cyprus. Once contact with him was established, Adhemar reached out. Though Simeon had written against Latin religious practices in a firm but reasonable tone, he was eager to work with the Western Church for the sake of Christian unity. Back in October, he and Adhemar had even co-authored a report on the crusade to send to the Christians of Europe. Now, upon hearing about the army's dire condition, he arranged for regular shipments of food and wine from Cyprus to the Crusader camp. Everything the island could spare. Despite the generous supplies sent by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the aid wasn't enough to relieve the widespread suffering in the Crusader camp. As hunger grew worse, more and more men began to desert. At first, it was just low-ranking soldiers slipping away in search of food or safety, either in nearby, more prosperous areas or on the long journey back to their homes. But then, one morning in January, it was discovered that Peter the Hermit had fled as well alongside a knight named William the Carpenter. William was known as a restless adventurer, not one to waste time on what he saw as a failing cause. He had previously deserted a campaign in Spain, but Peter's decision to run was harder to understand, given his spiritual role in the crusade. Tancred quickly led a party to catch the deserters and brought them back in disgrace. Since Peter's public image was still important, his betrayal was quietly forgiven. William, on the other hand, was treated harshly. He was made to stand all night in Bohemon's tent, and in the morning was given a stern and threatening lecture. William swore never to desert again until the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, but he would eventually break that promise. Peter's reputation took a serious hit, though he would soon have a chance to redeem himself, as the army continued to shrink from starvation and desertion. Adhemar decided that a strong appeal for help needed to be sent back to Europe. It carried more weight. He drafted the message in the name of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who had likely agreed to the plan. The tone of the letter is revealing. The Patriarch addressed all faithful Christians in the West, claiming leadership over both Greek and Latin bishops in the East. He called himself apostolic and went as far as to declare that anyone who failed to fulfill their crusading vow would be excommunicated. The letter sounded as though it came from an independent religious leader. Adhemar, the Pope's legate, would not have used such language if he had intended the Patriarch to be subordinate to Rome. Whatever Pope, Urban's long-term intentions were for the governance of the Eastern churches, Adhemar was not pushing. For papal supremacy, we don't know how the letter was received in the West, or what kind of response it brought, although the Crusaders showed proper respect to the leaders of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Their relationship with the political head of the Eastern Empire began to break down. In early February, the emperor's representative, Tancred, suddenly left the army. He had been with the Crusaders since Nicaea, accompanied by a small group mostly made up of guides and engineers, and had appeared to have a good relationship with the Crusades leaders. When the Crusaders captured cities like Comana and Coxen, they had handed them over to him as expected, and in return, he praised their bravery and skill in his reports back to Constantinople. At the time, there were several different rumors about why he left, but there's no reason to doubt the explanation he gave when he returned to the capital. According to him, Bohemond summoned him one day and warned him confidentially that the other Crusader leaders believed the emperor was secretly supporting the Turks. Because of this, Bohemond claimed they were plotting to assassinate Tancred. In revenge, Tancred believed the threat was real, given the tense atmosphere in the army at the time. With tempers flaring and desperation setting in, it wouldn't have been surprising for someone to be made a scapegoat. Tancred also believed the Crusaders, exhausted and starving, had little hope of capturing the powerful city of Antioch. His earlier suggestion that they should starve the city into surrender by seizing the castles that controlled its surrounding supply routes had been ignored, so he announced that he was returning to Byzantine territory to organize a system of resupplying the army. He boarded a ship at the port of St. Simeon and set sail for Cyprus. To make it appear as though he intended to return, he left most of his staff behind with the army. But once he was gone, Bohemond's allies spread rumors that Tatesius had fled out of cowardice or even treachery, fearing the coming Turkish counterattack. They argued that if the emperor's own representative had behaved so dishonorably, then the Crusaders were no longer bound by any promises to the Byzantine Empire. In other words, they were free to keep Antioch for themselves.